Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about Scottish independence, roughly going from the year 83 to 1886. Obviously, I won't be going into too much detail, so this is just a general overview, but yeah, I'm going to be covering William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and the Stuarts. And yeah, I won't be doing Scottish independence in the 20th century because it's a different kind of independence rather than what I'm talking about is more monastical no yeah monarchical fights, but in 20th century it's very political. So that's ready for another video. Right now I'm just going to do from 83 to 1886. So let's start. Well, in the early years, the kingdom was officially established in 843. Before this, the Caledonians, which were locals, defended Scotland against the Romans. So the Romans did have an interest in Scotland. They used guerrilla tactics and nighttime raids, and the first victory that's recorded in Scottish history that I could find was the Battle of Mons Graupius, or how you pronounce it, or Graupius, in 83 AD. Well, Romans never got too far into Scotland, and in the Pict tribe, which were a tribe in the north of Scotland, they carried out border raids. And by the year 212, the Romans officially abandoned Scotland, and by the year 410, they officially abandoned Britain. Well, in the 8th century, the Vikings landed in the British Isles and settled down, and in the 9th century, Kenneth MacAlpin united the tribes of Scotland against the invaders and officially founded the Kingdom of Scotland in the year 843. So that's just a bit of background of the early years of Scottish independence, but here is where it really gets brutal. In the Wars of Scottish Independence. Well, at one point in the 12th century, or no, not even that, in the 13th, sorry, one point in the 13th century, I mean late, and maybe starting from the 12th century, maybe right until the end of the 13th century, England started treating Scotland as a feudal territory. And the Scots said no. So they banded together under this freedom fighter called William Wallace, made famous by the film Braveheart, Mel Gibson, which isn't that historically accurate. Maybe one day I'll make a video on it. I don't know. But William Wallace was this freedom fighter who won the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297, but did lose the Battle of Falkirk in July 1298. Then in the 14th century, William Wallace went on the run, was captured and eventually executed in August 1305. Now, his execution is brutal. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, and I did a video on this already, but that's one of the most brutal methods of execution I've ever heard. It's horrible. Well, years after this, a guy called Robert the Bruce seized power. There's this movie I highly recommend it. It's called Outlaw King, and it tells the story of a bit of Robert the Bruce. Again, I don't know how historically accurate that is. I'm guessing relatively, although not that much. And yeah, it's on Netflix, so if you want to check it out, go watch that. Well, he seized power in Scotland and became the new King of Scots. Well, he won the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and when this this was part of the first war of Scottish independence, and Robert the Bruce continued fighting and ended up winning the war in 1328. When Bruce died, a new war of Scottish independence broke out. The Second War of Scottish Independence, as you could probably guess. And, this didn't reach as much conflict as the first one did. Mainly because by this point, this was the late 14th century, or the second half of the 14th century, and England was becoming more and more focused on France and this 100 Years' War. So that period of Scottish independence died along with Robert the Bruce, and William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and it's Robert the Bruce, not Robert the Bruce. Anyway, that period died because there was a second war, like I said, that wasn't as prominent, and then there was relatively calm. I mean, people weren't happy with England. There were a separate kingdom. Now it was this kingdom of Scotland and the kingdom of England. Well, then come the Tudors, and then comes Elizabeth I, who actually died childless in 1603. James VI of Scotland, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, one of the most famous Scottish queens. I've done a video on her if you want to check that out. She was executed by Elizabeth I, leaving and abdicated in favor of James VI, who, like I said, was King of Scotland and took the English throne after Elizabeth's death, as well as the Irish throne. Now, he was the first monarch to ever unite the English, the Scottish, and the Irish under one crown. But he wanted to unite them under a kingdom, because it's not the same thing uniting them under a crown. Yes, it's one king, but he is the King of England, the King of Scotland, and the King of Ireland. He is not the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. There's a difference. But he wanted to unite them all under one kingdom. This was really unpopular and eventually caused rebellion and a civil war. Charles I, following the son of James VI, he was really, when James VI, James I of England. So I'm going to be referring to him as James I from now on. Well, Charles I, son of James I, was very tyrannical and didn't really know how to handle things, so he ended up losing a ton of support in Scotland. And actually in the Civil War, he fled to Scotland and was denied protection there. He was handed over to England, to the Parliament, or the New Model Army, because the Scots did not like Charles. However, they did like Charles II. I mean, Charles I in Scotland is a bit. Some Scots did, some didn't, but I mean, they eventually handed him over to the New Model Army, and then Charles was executed. And here comes Charles II, who was crowned King of Scotland from 1649 to 1651, but then had to flee because there was this. I think this. I'm not that strong in the spirit, but there was a battle, and Charles II had to flee and left England and Scotland, and Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector in 1653. Well, Cromwell died in 1658. That's Oliver Cromwell. Then came Richard Cromwell, who was deposed after just 1 year, and Charles II retook the throne in 1660, and again, this was the throne of England, the throne of Scotland, and the throne of Ireland, separately. Again, not the same thing. Well, when Charles II died, his brother James II took the throne, but he was deposed by William III, William of Orange, who would go on to be William III, and Mary II. In this bloodless revolution called the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Now, James, it may seem like he's unimportant, and when I did my research, in the Stuarts, in terms of English politics, it does seem he's unimportant at his time, but he actually ended up being really, really, really significant because, he was Catholic and he had supporters, and his supporters were named Jacobites. Now you may have heard that name someplace else, and it's because it's a really important movement who supported James II and his descendants. Well, William III and Mary II died, and here comes Queen Anne. She inherited the throne and brought about this new era of Anglo-Scottish relations. This is because, Scotland had tried to colonize Panama, what is now known as Panama, and failed. And, Scotland was a bit of a mess. They didn't have that much of a leader and wasn't that involved. And, the Scottish Parliament was divided and succession was unclear. They did not know if they were going to continue with the Stuarts. Also, Queen Anne was childless, so no one really knew what was going to happen. No one really knew. So, on May the 1st, 1707, England and Scotland signed the Act of Union, therefore officially unifying England and Scotland under the same kingdom. So now it was Great Britain. Well, this treaty passed gave Scotland economic security and access to England's colonial trade network. So a bit of financial stability, which was kind of good. Well, the coinage, taxes, and trade were standardized. Also, the children and descendants of James II who had died, I don't know if he had died yet, or he had just died. I think he died in 1704 or something like that. If he hadn't, I'm not 100% sure when he died, but that's not important. His descendants are what's important. They were excluded from succession with this treaty. Scotland was still managed to maintain the legal, religious, and educational system, so Scotland was allowed to remain Protestant. No, Protestant, Catholic. No. Yeah, Protestant. I was saying Protestant. Yes, Protestant. Because James II was Catholic, but he was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution by Protestants, and then Anne was Protestant too. So forget what I said. Scotland was allowed to remain Protestant, but that wasn't that big a deal because England was Protestant, so it's not that big a deal. 100 years before this, it would have been, but not right now. Well, also this British Parliament was created, so now England and Scotland were represented in the same Parliament. However, the Scots were severely underrepresented. There weren't that many members of Parliament from Scotland, so it wasn't that big of a win. Some poets said that they had sold Scotland for English gold or something like that, and it did really benefit the English more than the Scots. So it did grant Scotland some stability, but did not really help that they were back under the English crown, because they had been part of the English crown up until 1328, when the Scottish independence had been declared, separate kingdom, and then by 1707 they were part of the same kingdom again. Well, this union was quite unpopular, especially in Scotland. In England, it wasn't exactly welcome, but it is what it is. But in Scotland, it was really, really unpopular. And by 1715, there was huge discontent, and this Jacobite rebellion started. Jacobite being the followers of James II and his descendants. Well, what they want to do is repeal the Union, restore Scotland's parliament, and restore the crown of Scotland under the descendants of James II. So basically, Scottish independence. George I, who was now king of Scotland, mind you, he was only 1 year into his reign. He came into the throne in 1714, and after the death of Queen Anne. So he was just 1 year into his reign and managed to quell this rebellion. There was another rebellion in 1745. This was ultimately a failure because, well, the guy who led this was Prince Charles Edward Stuart, also known as the Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Young Pretender. He had relation to James II, but didn't gather enough support and lost this rebellion. The British, as a result, imposed these harsh policies to dismantle this Highlands clan system, as well as ending the Jacobite cause. And for the time being, those were the matters. In the late 18th century, which is now modern, this is like modern Scotland, relatively modern Scotland. This is from like the last part I'm going to talk about. Well, Scotland wasn't by no means happy with this union, but they they joined the English in the fight against American colonies in Ireland. Ireland by this point was posing a much bigger threat to England than Scotland, because Ireland was not technically part of Great Britain. So it was better to fight the Irish and the American colonies with England, rather than fight the English, which I don't know how that would have worked out. Well, by this point, Scottish textile industry was thriving, and industrialization and urbanization were commencing, and here is the Industrial Revolution. Scotland really benefited from this. It was mainly England, but also Scotland. Scotland really developed during this Industrial Revolution. And they not only became more prominent in their economy, but also in parliament and politics, because in the British government, the Scots gradually gathered more prominence. Well, in 1886, Prime Minister William Gladstone, he was British, obviously, but he was from Scotland. He was Prime Minister, which is not that bad, if you think about it. Well, he said, okay, let's restore the Irish Parliament. Let's have this Parliament that would be separate, technically separate from Westminster, but, subordinate to it. So they still had to obey England, but they had a little separate parliament. In Scotland, this was like, oh my god, we could do this? We should do this. And the Scottish office had been established a year prior, so this nationalist view, like, we could have a separate parliament that, would be subordinate to England, but it would be only Scots. Hell yeah. And, well, that never happened, but that idea gathered quite a bit of support. And yet that is Scottish independence from 83 to 1886. Like I said, the main period is from the 14th century, and, well, the Stuarts with the monarchs from England and Scotland, that is not fighting for Scottish independence, that is just showing how Scotland had gradually come back into the power of the English. By no means was Scotland a subordinate of England. It was ruled by the same monarch, but England and Scotland were two countries governed by the same person, rather than what it had been before, that it was England and then Scotland. And that's literally it. That's all I have to say. Maybe, like I said, one day I'll do a video on modern Scottish independence, but that's a separate topic because that's more referendums. I mean, pre-World War One. There's a bit there. Then post-World War Two. That's quite a bit there, and especially nowadays with Brexit, that's a huge debate. But one day maybe I'll do that. I'll definitely look into seeing how accurate Braveheart is, how accurate Outlaw King is. So I guess thank you for watching. Bye.